Neighbor is not just literal neighbor. Those are certainly our neighbors, and we are certainly to love them, but it's not just limited to them. The best description I have heard for neighbor in this context is from a writer named Jamie Dickinson. He says, a neighbor is anyone and everyone within the ripple effect of your life. And so if you imagine all of life as an ocean and your single life as a stone, if you throw the stone of your life out into the ocean of life at large, your life is going to make some ripples, yes? A neighbor is anyone and everyone who is within distance of the ripples of your life. That means all of your motivations, all of your intentions, all of your words, your actions, all of your thoughts, you're going and coming and going again to work and to school and to the coffee shop and the barista you meet and the banker who gives you your money. All of those things and so much more. Anybody and everybody within the ripple effect of your life, that is your neighbor. And so if that is true, we have to ask the question, do we actually love the people who are within distance of the ripple effect of our lives? I mean, ask yourself that question. Yes, you probably love one or two, but in terms of the entire ripple of everybody who is within distance of the ripple effect of your life, do you love them? And let me make a confession to you. When I consider this question, do I actually love my neighbor? The reality, the very hard, difficult reality that I am faced with most often is that yes, from time to time, I love those within the ripple effects of my life. But most of the time, it is not love that I extend toward them. It's all sorts of other things. I will confess this to you, that sometimes, rather than loving my neighbor, I judge my neighbor. The reality is sometimes, and this is very common, I don't love my neighbor, I usually just ignore my neighbor. Sometimes in my worst moments, I'm suspicious of my neighbor. Sometimes in my better moments, I at least tolerate my neighbor. And then again, in my worst moments, I find myself tempted to profit off of my neighbor or to neglect my neighbor. And if you connect all of the dots of the nexus web of my decision making, you can make an argument that I even exploit my neighbor. Now, I say this as a confession to you without fear, because in a room this size and with everybody who's watching online, my guess is that most of us, if not all of us, could relate to one or two or all of the things I just said. That you too, like me, find yourself judging rather than loving your neighbor. You too, like me, find yourself often ignoring or being suspicious of, or maybe just tolerating or profiting off of, or neglecting or even exploiting your neighbors, more often than not. And yet the biblical command is not to do any of these things. It is rather what? To love our neighbor. Now, if we're going to do that, then we have to reckon with the reality of our lives, that often we don't. That's where it starts. And this calling to love our neighbors, again, it is not because you want to be a good moral person or culture tells you so. The reason followers of Jesus love our neighbors, and maybe you're not a follower of Jesus and you're here. If you are, we're thrilled you're here. Our hope is that you just get some insight into why Christians do what they do. And here's one of the things you need to know. The reason Christians love their neighbor is not because, again, it's the moral thing to do or culture tells us to. It's because it is a part of God's plan from the very beginning. God's plan, and when I say very beginning, I'll show you in a moment, I mean the very beginning. God's plan was for his people to love him and to love one another. Let me show you. I just want to take like 5 to 7 minutes to just do a survey of the entire human story. Sound good? We'll just go beginning to end in 7 minutes or less. Okay? That sounds audacious, but it's really not. Just hang with me and hold on to your seats. Okay. Genesis 1. You're like, oh, Genesis 1. He's serious. He's like going to do the whole thing. I am. But I'm going to skip. I'm going to skip like thousands of years. But that's okay. Genesis 1, verses 27 to 28. Remember, Genesis 1 tells us the story of a good God creating a good world. This is before sin enters the picture. Sin is this nasty three-letter word that the Bible uses to describe human rebellion against God and God's plan for human flourishing and for his glory. Now, this is before all of that. This is when everything is awesome, okay? Genesis 1, 27 to 28. So, God creates a good world, and the culmination of his creation, it says this: God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Okay. At the beginning of the human story, a good God creates a good world, and the culmination of his creation is man and woman. He creates human beings, and he gives them a very particular command. It's really interesting. What he tells them is, rule over my creation. You see that there? It says, rule over and subdue the birds and the fish and the creatures and the land. These words are representative of like all of creation. Now, when we hear the words rule over or subdue, it sounds negative to us. It sounds oppressive. But in the original language of Genesis, those words and phrases, they're better described as words depicting stewardship or care or cultivation. Think a farmer tilling the soil and growing crop. Okay, that's what God is saying here. God creates human beings, and he tells these humans, I want you to care for and steward and cultivate my creation. Now, pause here for a moment. This is really important. Many of us I grew up believing that in Genesis 1 and 2, when God created the world was perfect. And if that is true, this command makes no sense. Because perfection means nothing should be added and nothing should be changed. If I presented to you a perfect painting, and then I took a brush and I started painting additional colors, by nature, by definition, that which is perfect is no longer perfect because I've changed it, correct? Creation at the beginning of time is not perfect. That word is not found anywhere in Genesis 1 and 2. In fact, what creation is not perfect, but Genesis 1:31, God saw all that he had made, and it was very, what? Good. That word implies not that it's perfect and nothing should be changed, but rather that it is teeming with potential. That it is good, and that it has the potential to bring about more and more endless amounts of good. That's how God creates the world. And so, before sin enters the picture, God creates not a perfect world, but a good world. And into that good world, he creates man and woman, human beings, and he commands the humans, I want you to steward, care for, and cultivate the goodness and bring about more good in the world. This is before sin. Since the beginning of God's story, his plan has always been for you and I to partner with him in bringing about good in the world.